Welcome to episode 29 of the Filmmakers podcast. This is Jamie Benning speaking to you here from my haunted house in southeast London. Thanks for joining me again, and I hope you enjoyed the last episode, my chat with Roger Christian, art director and set decorator on both Alien and Star Wars. Looking forward to his documentary coming out soon. If you're new to the podcast, do go back and have a look at what has come before. I've had quite a range of guests now in the last 28 episodes. If you're a return listener, thanks again for joining me. As always, thank you to all of you that support me on Patreon, patreon.com/Jamie Benning. I do take this seriously now. It's a job as much as it is a hobby. So if you do listen to the podcast and you've enjoyed it, consider becoming part of the Filmmakers family yourself. And you can do that by visiting patreon.com/Jamie Benning, as I said. And for as little as $12 per year, you could really help me in continuing this endeavour, which I'm really enjoying. I hope you are too. Hopefully you'll see that I'm giving this a lot of care and attention at the moment, and I'm spending quite a lot of time making sure I get interesting and varied guests for me to talk to you and for you to listen to. If you consider it like buying me 2 coffees or buying me 2 beers in 1 year, that really could make the difference in me continuing to do this. So thanks so much to the 58 of you that are already patrons. I still plan to have a competition coming soon just for you. Keep an eye on Twitter at JamieSWB and on the Patreon channel as well. And if you are unable to support me, that's fine. The people that do support me are the ones helping pay for it, and that's the model, and that's how it works. It's a good system. But if you do have time, please leave a review and also tell your friends about the podcast. Use social media, get on Facebook, get on Twitter, Instagram, tell them about it, or just maybe your work friends who are like-minded. Okay, so for this episode I spoke to another legend of filmmaking, Dan Perri. He's a titles designer and has been in the game for decades. You'll have seen his work on films as varied as Star Wars, The Warriors, New York, New York, Nashville, The Exorcist, After Hours. Dan is engaged by filmmakers to bring his style, which there isn't really a defined style. Dan is able to kind of adapt chameleon-like to the different requirements of the filmmakers, and you can really see why he's been in the industry for so long. And if you think about an opening sequence, it's the first thing we see, and it often sets the tone of the whole movie and starts us off on the story of the film. So it's an important part of the movie. If you're kind of unaware of what goes into Dan's work, obviously, as well as listening to this episode, you can visit danperri.com and look at some of his work there. I'll also add some links to some of the work he's done in the show notes. So here's my chat with Dan Perri, titles designer, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So Dan, when did you first have an interest in art and design? Was it something that's always been a part of you?
Well, art and design, certainly, yes. It's always been a part of me. My mother, who's still living at 98, is a painter. And so since I was a kid, she would be painting, not professionally, but she always had paintings going. And she still does at her age. But that apparently, as I can best remember, encouraged my interest in art and design and, drawing with my hand and all those things that artists do. So from a very early age, I started drawing in school and working with clay and 3 dimensions and so on. And then in high school, I was very fortunate to have as my art teacher a woman who had been an agency art director in New York on Madison Avenue at the major agencies there. And for the 4 years I was in high school with her as my teacher, she exposed me and all my colleagues to the best of the design world, graphic design, advertising design, and so on. She made sure we had the latest copies of all the magazines that were published then on design and art and graphics. So I learned about all the art directors and designers and painters and illustrators and so on that were working in the advertising business. And I then wanted to be an agency art director. And I did for a few years later. But graphic design was my real bailiwick. And I learned about Saul Bass and followed him and could recognize his work anytime I saw it in any of those magazines, and eventually met Saul, and he mentored me for a couple of years and encouraged me on, and eventually wanted to hire me. And that, I had gone to the Navy and worked as a journalist and did graphic design and so on there. And when I came out, I had this new portfolio of things I'd done, took it to him, and he offered me a job. But something went off in my head where I said to myself, if Saul wants me, I must be good enough. So I turned down the job and opened up a little studio of my own. And I've been doing that ever since. I discovered film titles along the way, a little later, certainly from Saul, but that there were other people who were doing title design, and it was this little niche within the film business, and it's something that you could do yourself without having to have a big staff and things that Saul had. So I began doing that, and eventually it was competing with and parallel to Saul for many years. I could go on with that story, but
no, I mean that's the name people think of when they think of title design. I guess Saul being the man who sort of set the standard in a way. But I
yes.
guess when you joined the film industry, had it already passed the point where in the studio system, I guess directors didn't necessarily have a hand in the titles on their films. It was just done by the titles department. But then that would have
Right.
changed at some point.
That's right. When I first began, it was 1969 was my first year. I remember because my children were born. I have twins that were born in 69. So that kind of demarcated it. And at the time I was working with a title designer who I discovered, and he was doing major studio titles. And he'd come out of one of the studio title departments as well. And then his competitors, and then who later became my competitors, were all from the either title departments of the studios or Pacific Title and one other big title and graphic, they were a title and optical effects company, and they had a staff of people doing titles. So all of them came out of those places and began working independently. So I was amongst them at that point. But gradually, I remember the Fox Studios title department closed, and then the Columbia department and so on, Warner Brothers as well, and Universal, and then the last one was MGM, who closed. So then there was no department to go to. If you were doing an MGM film as a director, you couldn't any longer have your titles done by their department. So then these independent people who had been connected to those departments then became the sources for title design. I can remember losing jobs to those departments when they were still operating, but then once they closed, then you had a wider field, and there was usually a handful of us, 4 or 5. I might have been the 6th one that was around and competing with each other, and we'd run into each other at cattle calls where producers would invite 3 or 4 designers in to see the film and offer ideas, and then they would choose from that.
Was there ever a time, just winding back a little bit, was there ever a time you can remember kind of noticing film titles? Was that back in your graphic design days at college, or was there a particular film that stood out to you?
I wasn't, as much as I loved film and went to films all the time as a kid and high school student, when I realized that once I learned of Saul Bass and he doing titles, though that wasn't the major part of his work, he only did a small quantity of titles amongst all of his famous logos and poster designs and so on. But I think I realized that titles were something that I could perhaps do when I learned of Saul's work and saw his title designs. Then I became aware of a few other, at the time, big name designers that were doing wonderful work in feature films. TV shows, there was a couple of guys who worked only in TV, so they didn't cross over, and they were not my competitors because I really wasn't pursuing TV work, although I did get some on occasions. I wasn't after that. I was after the feature work all the time. But there was a series of, the fellows who did the early James Bond films were ones that I became aware of. Steve Frankfurt, a fellow named Ted Trinkus, Robert Brownjohn, who was an American working in London and did the first couple of Bond films. And then there's a few that were from the studio system in LA primarily, who were my main competitors. Um, most of them have died now. I'm the only one left of that original group, and I'm still working.
And what was the first film that kind of put Dan Perri on the map, as it were?
It was The Exorcist,
Mm.
and it came out of a series of incidents. I had done a film at United Artists. It was one of my first studio films because I started out doing independent films and then television shows for David Wolper, who was a big documentarian and had a whole building of people that he was cranking out a dozen documentaries at a time. But I got hired to do this. And it was funny thing, it was in competition with the MGM title department because it was an MGM United Artists film called Electroglide in Blue. And I did a title sequence for that. And then I learned later that the sound effects were really excellent on that film. And apparently Billy Friedkin, as he was preparing to do The Exorcist, went to see Electroglide to evaluate the sound effects and consider hiring the effects designer for his film. And he saw my titles on the film and apparently made note of it, and then somehow got in touch with me and hired me for The Exorcist. And when that hit so big and was one of the first blockbusters, the way it goes in Hollywood, at least then, was anyone associated with a hit, you have a pathway now to new work because everyone wants those people who worked on these films. The superstition would be that, well, that film was successful because that person did the effects and that person did the titles and that person did the camera work. So I want those people. So my film will be a success, So then I was pursued by the industry in general, and anyone I would call to try to get an interview to do their film would say, come on over. They welcomed me where I couldn't get through to them at all before I was known because of that film. So it was a whole different world once you're associated with a hit. And for me, it just went on. I don't have as much work as I used to, though I don't even want it, but I always had the crop of the best directors and producers who had been making hits, and they all wanted me to work on their films.
It's funny, isn't it? When, as you say, it's like they've captured that magic once. They want to hold on to it or for the next project.
Yes.
That font you used in The Exorcist, of course, has become very iconic. Was that your choice? Was that Friedkin's choice? Was that Blatty's choice? Where did the sort of design process happen there?
That was my choice. As best I recall, I know that the style is called Weiss Initials #2. And it was used on the first printing of the book. So it came out of Blatty's publisher's design staff or whoever. Then once it became a big hit and they reprinted the book before it was a film, they changed the type style to something more generic. But the first run, as best I remember now, I may be wrong about this, was that type style. And I had to find it because I wanted to use it, and I had to find where it existed as a font so I could use it on all the titles. Then it was the subtleties of that project of using that type style in such a way that it was powerful and effective and had complementary design elements to it that could last through a long end title sequence, and still be effective and readable and all those things that are necessary for title design.
Dan, I can hear quite a lot of tapping on the desk or something.
Oh,
there.
I'm sorry.
Is that okay? Sorry.
Sort of
I do that as well.
Yeah, sorry.
Now, the opening titles, they often define the movie because it's the first thing we see. They often set the tone. It's our first impression. But you have to serve the overall story as well, despite your part being a small part of the overall production. Can you define what the purpose of the opening titles are, and how do you approach that?
Well, in the commercial film world, titles are required by contract. All these technicians and actors who are working on the film the producers have agreed to give them credit in certain ways. So when those credits are given to me, put these on the film, in some way, I have to comply with all those requirements, and they go into size and color and comparison. If this actor has 100% of title, then this actor must be as well. And these others, there might not be those requirements, but they have to be on the film. And there's an order of the tech credits within that is usually followed. So all those things I have to be aware of, and I have to follow them in order to put titles on the film that comply with and meet all the requirements. So there's restrictions already. I mean, if I said, let's make this guy a lot bigger than the other titles, for graphic purposes and to emphasize his name or whatever, can't do that. So I'm compelled to, within the confines of those restrictions, design something that is interesting and applies to the film. And so I draw off of my emotions from seeing the film. And fortunately, things come to me and always have, and many times multiple ideas from my emotional response to the film. So I have to scribble them down as fast as I can because they'll evaporate, they'll go away. I have these images in my head. Oftentimes they're completely realized. So I somehow see them in my mind's eye, and I will sketch them down. I'll grab a piece of paper, an envelope, something that is around, and with a pencil, with an eraser on the back of it so I can change it. I'll just draw it out and then refine it and develop it on paper, and then eventually scan it now and take it into the computer and then manipulate it further.
Mm. But you say you get that from an emotional response from watching the film. So at what point do you get involved in the project then? Is it when the film is already locked, or is it in early versions, early edits of the film?
Well, it varies a lot. On Close Encounters, Spielberg had the wisdom to hire me even before the film was shot. So I designed a logo for the film even before they went into production. And then everything, all correspondence was done in writing, on paper, mail, and so on. So I designed this very elegant stationery, letterhead, business card, and envelopes and things. And then I designed stickers that we stuck onto everything, all the equipment boxes, and we made T-shirts. And on the back it said CE3K, which was the code name of the film. And all the crew wore them on location, and they were all kind of bonded by this common image that represented the film. And then fortunately, he had the power to require that Columbia, the distributor, would carry through with the graphics I did for the titles and the other applications. And then eventually I was hired to do the entire ad campaign to maintain the integrity of what we'd done throughout.
See, I always thought that typeface, that font you came up with for Close Encounters, that's got that kind of the lines through it. I always assumed that was a reference to like them looking through the windows through the Venetian blinds or something. But you hadn't even seen the film at this point.
No, but I gleaned things from the script, and the first script Paul Schrader had written, and then later Spielberg took over and rewrote it, and eventually got credit for being the sole writer on it. But the parallel lines were more about, for me, just the suggesting of a mystery, something that we know about, and that they be very emphatic and apparent, so that there is something that's disturbing about it. And going along with it, with the subtitles of Close Encounter, a sighting, and then a third was a contact. So it progressed, and that those lines that follow each other were sort of a progression as well. So it felt connected, and there was something that you felt that was out there that you didn't know, but yet was intrigued by. And I mean, all those subtle, emotional, non-linear kind of ideas and thoughts that were what kind of guided me in designing that. And the type style was, there was a lot of curves where there were normally corners on letters that gave it an organic and kind of humanistic or alien feel, because the aliens were going to be these very round, soft edged, almost human figures. So there was a connection with the body curves and the human organic senses that came with that. So it all fit together really well. And it was a type style that I found, a very obscure style called Handel Gothic, which I've never used again. I just didn't think, I've never come upon a project that I thought it was right for. And it would have also been, plagiarizing myself. And I don't tend to do that. I don't, use another idea that I did previously, because I think every film is unique. And that idea for the first one would never apply to the second one, because that second one doesn't have the same characteristics and personality of the first one. And I never used Weiss initials again.
I'm looking at that poster for Close Encounters behind you there. Such an iconic image that I love that, because it doesn't give away anything about the movie. There's just, we're going down this road, there's a light in the distance. What the hell is it? I need to go and see this movie. It's the best kind of movie poster, I think.
It literally draws you in. You're on the road, you're traveling towards it. So you're already going for it. Come on ahead.
Something like Taxi Driver, then, which is a film that still fascinates and terrifies me in equal measure, and not and partly down to that opening sequence with the Bernard Herrmann score, and again, it really sets the tone. And had that footage already been shot? This is a question that I've got really about. Obviously, you're coming up with the titles, but you need to also consider the shots that are in there. Is it often the case that there'll be shots that you're taking from dailies, or are they shots that are purposefully shot for the title sequence on the part of the director, or have you composed them yourself and then they've gone and shot them in some cases?
Yes to all those things.
Yeah, right.
And the fourth step would be that I composed shots and shot them myself, went out and directed them, and then took them to the cutting room and assembled the sequence. In the case of Taxi Driver, David Nichols, he was a kind of a creative consultant, visual advisor, went out and directed footage, just shot all over New York City day and night, and shot over 200,000 feet of footage of just drive-bys and smoke and cars going past and so on. So I took all that footage and viewed it with Marshall Lucas, one of the editors, who was married to George at that time. And we cut together a sequence from the second unit that I assembled with her and built it so that it would accommodate all the titles. Whatever, I was given a list by then of these credits that we have to have at the front of the film. So I made sure it was long enough to accommodate that. But then I chose shots that were atmospheric and emotionally charged and so on, and created a sequence. And though normally I would work against the music or with the composer, so he knows what I'm doing visually and then I know what he's doing musically, that didn't happen on Taxi Driver. I didn't have the opportunity to hear the music. Bernard Herrmann was doing that independently, and he was on a different schedule than I was on. So after I cut the sequence and seeing cuts of the film by that point, I had an idea that we should explore the what I call the underbelly of New York City, the horrible part of it that Travis Bickle lived in and drove all over the city and dealt with those people in that horrific place that he lived. And that should be interpreted in a very graphic, high contrasty way. So I knowing the tools that were available to me in the optical world, I knew that I could copy all the shots on what's called an interpositive, a special stock that Eastman created in order to duplicate those images as accurately as possible. This IP stock was for that purpose, but I chose to shoot from a color print, which was a positive image. And when you shot that onto dupe negative, everything was heightened. The contrast was heightened enormously, and the colors were very saturated. So the blacks were real black, and the colors were real dense and deep. So it gave me the look and the feel that I wanted. So I shot the whole sequence from color print, and then the one shot, the POV looking through the windshield, was raining, and there's the kind of streaking effect. I discovered at the time a new effect called Slit Scan, which is a process of photographing and rephotographing a shot, and every time you rephotograph it, you slip it one frame, and you can do as many frames as you need. So we did 12 passes, and it created this streaking, trailing effect, which was perfect for the mood at that moment and seeing through Travis Bickle's eyes what was out there in this horrible world. Then the titles themselves, I wanted them to be as much like the street signs in New York as possible. So I went to the city of New York's traffic department, and I found that the type style that they use for all the signs, the ones up high on the metal boxes, not the ones that say 20 miles an hour or, turn left here, which was a different style. So this kind of compressed vertical graphic Gothic style I used for all the titles, and I set them the way they would be on the signs as well. And then I superimposed them over the footage, and there was a lot of smoke and neon and so on. And when I exposed them, normally you would carry a protective mat to where the title would be clean and sharp coming from the title elements, but I purposely pulled the mat so that the shot would contaminate the titles, and therefore they would glow and pulse, and whatever the density of that shot was. If it got dark and light when smoke came by or whatever, they would affect them. So that they were integrated into the backgrounds rather than in front of them. More took you into it because you're reading them, and that's why they're there. So you were therefore included in the environment that was created by that sequence. Then the day I delivered the sequence to Marty, often they're on the mixing stage or doing ADR or some post phase, and I will come over and show it to them and deliver it. So Marty was in the last stage of mixing the sound, the music and the sound effects and the dialogue. And I came into the room, and Marty asked me to bring the film roll. I had a box with the film, had a print from the shoot. And I brought it to the projection booth. They cut it in place at the head of the reel one. And then as I came down the stairs, it started on the screen, and even the Columbia logo was converted from color print. So it looked very contrasting. So then I saw it for the first time with the music. And once it ended, the lights came up, and Marty, these stages are an empty room, the size of a normal theater, so they can get the full sound effect of how it would sound in a theater rather than in a small room, a little tiny box. So Marty's walking across the room, rushing toward me to tell me how much she was happy with him and appreciated what I'd done. And so he's praising me, and he says, say hello to Bernard Herrmann. So I turned to my right, and in the darkness, I hadn't seen him, but there was this little natty man standing there, beautifully dressed and very gentle and calm in his demeanor. And he smiled at me and extended his hand, and we shook hands, and he complimented my work, and I complimented his, and we were just joyous, the three of us, celebrating the completion of this opening of this film, which became a classic. So it was a wonderful moment that
amazing
happened just spontaneously. Yeah,
it's amazing to think that you're off doing your three kind of separate bits, and it just all comes together in that room for that moment. That's
it's really magic.
Yeah,
sometimes it's really, really quite wonderful to. That's the culmination of all that effort. Part of the composer and the designer. And someone's doing the effects perhaps, and they come and deliver them, and they're cut in, and you see them with the sound effects that go with it, and suddenly it's wow, it's a thrill. That's what you do it for. It's for those moments that you get appreciated, and you see how effective and how well it works and successful it's going to be, and all that. So yeah, it's a lot of emotion for me is certainly directly connected to the work and dealing with the filmmakers.
And so, who is your closest relationship with in doing the titles? Because that example you just gave there with Taxi Driver, it sounded like you were fairly autonomous. But are you in liaising with the art director, or the director, the editor, the composer? Is it the marketing department, or is it all of them, or none of them, or some of them?
All of them, and some of them, and it varies in every case. Many times I'll consult with the art director if there are things about the film that I see that I wonder how they came upon, or why are they using so much red color in the sets, or whatever it might be, that I can glean something from, perhaps. So I'll reach out to the art director, in some cases, or the production designer. Certainly the editor is always a key person in my world, dealing with them, with the backgrounds, whether I'm creating them or they're coming from the film, or one of those where the editor and I will have to work together and cut them in and try different things, change lengths and order of the sequence and so on. So working with the editor, once I start working on the film, I'm always working with the editor in one way or another. And actually the director's there and oversees everything, and it's all done at his or her requirements and how they see things. So it's a very collaborative thing from the start to the finish.
When you were saying with Taxi Driver, you were kind of editing the footage together yourself. Would you have a Moviola or a Chem or a Steenbeck or something to do that on?
I do, but I wasn't. I might have occasionally made a splice or something, but Marcia was handling the film and doing the cut. But it was always at my direction. Let's try this shot here, And I remember I saw that shot going down Broadway. Well, let's have a look at that and see. And then we look at 10 minutes of a shot driving down Broadway, or whatever it might be. So it was in close contact with her. But when you work with the editor, there's even union problems with, you can't literally become the editor for that moment or that day, or so they have to do it. But it would be at my direction and my collaboration with them. And I say collaboration because working with a good person, good editor, or a good sound effects person, or whatever, you get something from them as you direct them to do it, something specific. They might think, oh, what about this instead? So, it gets better by working with good people during the processes of creating something. And I really regard that highly and value it a lot, to have that collaboration and that connection. And I'm an editor myself as well, so I really appreciate what it takes to do a good cut on something.
Yeah, it really does make the difference. There, just a little aside here. I used to live with a friend who I decided I was going to educate her on movies, because most of the movies she liked were crap, So I sat her down to watch Taxi Driver one day, and the title sequence had barely finished, and she said, "I don't like it. It terrifies me already." It just had that impact on
it. It was working then.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. My mother.
Go on.
I'm sorry. I just brought to mind something. My mother was married years ago to my second. Her second husband was an actor. He'd acted in studio films in the 30s and 40s, and he was always a villain. And he used to tell us that, you see a film and there's a character that you really hate him. He's really doing a good job. If he's meant to be hated and he's doing a good job. And so I always remember that creating a sequence that's supposed to be horrific, if it scares you, then you've done a good job. You've actually conveyed those feelings by how you've assembled something and put it together.
Yeah.
So that there's the proof in the pudding kind of thing,
Definitely. I guess, as well as having that sort of initial function of kind of informing the audience of what's to come, perhaps. You also can have like the big kind of cinematic wow moment. I guess the example I'm thinking of is Star Wars for George Lucas, that you've just got that big kind of fanfare and the logo fills the screen and all of that stuff. How were you engaged on Star Wars? How did that come about? And what did George reference other than Flash Gordon?
The other serial, Buck Rogers, was the second serial that was popular at the same time Flash Gordon was, in the 30s and 40s. So he asked me to look at all those episodes which he had acquired, and I'd go over to ILM, when ILM first became an entity. And he had a big building out in the valley where I always had to go and meet with him and wait for him for hours and view things and watch dailies with him and so on. And then many other features that might have had some elements that interested him that he wanted me to see. And then I would look at other films that came to my mind that I thought there might be something there. And at one point I came across a Cecil B. DeMille film from 1939 called Union Pacific, an American film which was about the railroad and the building of the railroad that connected the US. And the first shot was looking down empty railroad tracks, and tracks just converged to a horizon line. And then the titles for that film rolled from under the camera down the tracks as it was the train. And from that, I envisioned that notion being applied in space. So then the idea of tilting the titles so that they were in perspective and would roll down the tracks, and you could then deliver the information from the preamble that Lucas had given to me. And then the title, in this case, the title would come on first and pull that preamble behind it. So I presented the idea to Lucas and he loved it. So he gave me the green light to go ahead and put it together. So then months went by where I was developing the idea and all the endless subtleties that were required in order to make that work. I mean, for one thing, no one had shot, except Cecil B. DeMille, had shot titles in perspective like that. And I had to rig a way to shoot it. You couldn't do it on the animation stand because the bed doesn't tilt. So you had to do it live. So I had this big 4 foot by 8 foot piece of black cardboard that I pasted all the words of the preamble to. And the first step was to decide how many words per line would there be that you could get back far enough and still read it. And then how deep would that go? How many lines would that be? And the spacing between words might differ. Is it going to be flush right and left? Is it going to be ragged and centered? Or what colors are going to be? How fast is it going to move? How many lines per line would be in the frame before it gets so far back? All those things had to be tested and shot just endlessly. And every time I got something that I thought worth seeing, I would trek out to ILM, wait for Lucas for hours and watch dailies with him, explosions and whatever, and hang around with the other technicians. I got friendly with his secretary, so we'd commiserate about things, and it was all in service of this mad genius. And finally, each problem was solved, finally settled on the color, on the angle of perspective, on the horizon line, on the wording. And while that was going on, he was changing wording sometimes, give me a new set of words that he wanted to say. But finally, all the problems were solved, and I then shot it, and then shot it again, and so on, and finally delivered it. And when that day came, it was like a huge weight was lifted off of me. He really, for the most part, never liked what I was doing. There was always something wrong with it. And the early ideas, he just dumped on all of them. And finally, I was given a version of the logo that he used on a brochure that he'd used to present the project to Fox. And the letters were hairline thick, and the W was vertical and didn't tilt like a W normally does. So I changed all those things and redesigned it and made the lines thick enough so that they would hold on film, because there are limitations to what film can see. I mean, digitally now I can see a lot more detail, but back then you were stuck with the limitations of film. And then you had to create high contrast elements on black and white film and then superimpose them over the shot in color and carry mats to protect it. It was very much more complicated and fraught with problems and dangers. You could shoot this beautiful thing perfectly, and then the lab might screw it up when they developed it. there could be streaks in it or scratches or God knows what. So it was a very difficult process to work with. And then working with a difficult client on top of it, trying to do something that had never been done before with equipment that hadn't even been created. It was, I never realized all of this at the time. It was all in retrospect that I realized all these things existed in this. And out of it came this okay design. It just happened to become very, very famous because of the success of the film. So that's what happened in reality.
Mate, yeah, I've spoken to several people who worked for Lucas, and it was always the case that he never really, like you said with Scorsese's example, he never really bathed you in praise. He tells you when he doesn't like it, and if he doesn't say anything, he probably likes it.
Yeah, that's right.
And he's on to the next thought, kind of thing.
I came to realize that very few directors knew what they liked or what they wanted, but they always knew what they didn't like and didn't want. And when that came, they would immediately, dump on it and tell you how much they hated it and so on. I was working at Disney for Jeffrey Katzenberg when he was running Disney, and I did this really, really nice design for the logo of a film called The Rescuers Down Under. It's an animated film, and there were two directors on it, and they loved what I'd done, and we shot it and put it on the film, and they showed it to Katzenberg one morning, and they told me later that they said, "What do you think of the logo? It's great. I really liked it." And Katzenberg said, "I hate it, and I never want to see it again." And that was it. So that happens sometimes, and they're very emphatic when they realize they really dislike something, but rarely will they praise it. Scorsese might be the exception, but pretty much, and Dick Rush was an exception too. He was always very, very kind and appreciative of the work. And in different degrees, I've been praised by many directors, but not to the extent of Scorsese or to this severe other side of it from Lucas.
Okay, so we've reached about the halfway point of my conversation with Dan Perri. We'll be back after these short messages.
Here's what some people are saying about the Projection Booth podcast.
This podcast takes no shortcut in producing outstanding content. How they haven't become more widely recognized is beyond me.
I love this show. Smart commentary, in-depth interviews, and great production.
It's obvious how serious these guys take their podcast and bring that next level of professionalism that anyone would be hard-pressed to match.
There are few things better in life than listening to people who are both passionate and knowledgeable about their subject matter. The Projection Booth, with their wide and wild range of film discussions, is one of those things. Simple as that.
The Projection Booth is the highest quality film podcast around. I love the focus on cult films, witty, informative banter, and amazing interviews. The Projection Booth is the best podcast out there if you're a serious film lover.
The Projection Booth podcast, with new episodes available every week at projectionboothpodcast.com.
Are you tired of pop culture podcasts where the hosts exist in a constant, blissful state of agreement? Well, fear not. Let me introduce you to the Chinstroker versus Punter podcast. Mike is an ex-film student with a penchant for David Lynch, and Paul is your man on the street who likes what he knows and knows what he likes. Join us fortnightly as we discuss what we've been watching from our own very different perspectives. You can find us at csvsp.libsyn.com. Chinstroker versus Punter is a proud member of the Pod Syndicate family of podcasts.
If you want to get involved in the filmmaking industry but don't know where to start, check out raindance.org. Raindance is not only a film festival, but also somewhere that you can sign up for training and courses in subjects like acting, directing, producing. There are short courses and full-time degrees, and if you quote Jamie10, that's JAMIE10, you can get 10% off. So check out raindance.org to see what catches your eye, and maybe you'll get that job you've always dreamed of. And then maybe you can come on the podcast. It's funny, isn't it? Because if I think about posters and I think about titles on movies, anything that involves lettering, whether it's packaging or anything like that, I think we as consumers have a fairly instinctive reaction to it, in as much as we know when it doesn't look quite right.
Yeah, even if we can't verbalize it.
Yeah, well, I often can't, but I look at something, I just think, oh, that doesn't work. And I guess the real challenge is for somebody in like a director to be able to verbalize it, to be able to put it, in a way that you can understand. But I'm sure you've had direction before, just, saying make it better or make it different. What do you do at that
many
stage?
times a director might be great with his cameraman and his actors and get performance and so on, but sometimes not very good at conveying how they really feel. So you have to pry it out of them, or you have to show them things that are comprehensive enough that they can give you a response to it. Early on, I learned that showing a director a storyboard of an idea, even though it's very comprehensive and illustrates from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 exactly what happens, and something is zooming up or traveling or whatever it might be, and they say, yeah, great, good. And then I go and shoot something and bring it to them. They say, oh, I didn't think it was going to be that fast. See, I realized they could not visualize what I was describing. So I stopped doing storyboards and started doing testing and showing them things exactly the way I wanted it to be, so they could see and approve or disapprove it. So I learned from that I used to put these directors on a pedestal that, they must be much more brilliant and creative than I am, because they're directing films and I'm not, kind of thing,
Yeah.
I give them so much credit, and then you start to work with them and you realize they're times dumber than I am and don't have, so there's something missing. They might have this talent of directing and getting good camera work and good performance, but as far as getting the best out of all the other people, they just didn't have what it took. Once again, Scorsese is an exception. He knows all the phases of filmmaking, and he knows how to choose the right people and then let them do what they do.
Yeah.
He's smart enough, and he's going to get the best from them every time. And that makes his films that much better as a result. And any director that knows that and applies that principle is making good films. And sometimes they'll be successful, even though they're not good films, but they're successful for other reasons. And many times a film that has the best of everything still won't be successful. I mean, who the hell knows? As Robert Towne said, Bo Goldman said, nobody knows anything. That's really true.
One thing I will certainly say about your work, Dan, is that there isn't a distinctive Dan Perri look. You can't look at something and go, I think Dan did that. Whereas other designers, I think there's a certain style they subscribe to and they're hired on that basis because, I want something like that they've done before. Whereas your work, you look at it from Star Wars to Nashville to Close Encounters to New York. I mean, it's just all completely different and all speaks to what the film is about. I think that's the real value of your work. Do you think that's what's kind of kept you in business all these years?
I think so, as I think back on it, and it's a very complimentary thing for you to say. I appreciate that, and others have recognized that as well. And I've even been called a chameleon on occasions because of that. And it seems logical to me that since every film is different, and an idea that you used before or that you pulled from another designer's work might be right for the film you're working on. So if that be true, then certainly that film needs something like this instead of that, and therefore it would be different from what you've done previously. And I don't strive for doing something unique that I've never done before. It's the film that draws me to do that, because that's what the film needs in my eyes. So collectively, you see all these different films that have different titles that happen to have been done by the same person. So it's just a coincidence, I think, a happy coincidence. And I'm grateful that I've been involved with so many films that were successful and appreciated. And my film work has gone along with it, just gone with all those other aspects of that film that were well done and caused that film to be successful. But yeah, I just keep rolling along. A film will come to me and it needs design that I might not have done before. Maybe like Star Wars, no one had ever done it before. But if it's right for the film, then I've got to find a way to present it and then execute it. And there might not be the equipment or the methodology to do it. That becomes the problem itself to solve. And sometimes I've done things that cause problems to happen that have to be solved in order for the film to use that idea. Raging Bull's a good example of that. So if you want to hear this.
Yeah, I had a question about Raging Bull, but yeah, you go on.
Started out that Marty invited me to see the film. So I went to a screening room at Technicolor over on the east side of New York City, and the screening was just for me. So the lights went down, and then suddenly they came back up again, and the guy on this projections on the speaker said, "Oh, we have one more person that's joining you." So in walked Sidney Lumet, who came and sat next to me, and I introduced myself to him, and later he wanted me to do his next film, but he died before he could. But we viewed the film together, and then I went over to Marty's apartment on 57th Street, and I stopped at the Baccarat store, and I bought this beautiful crystal bull as a gift and brought it to him. And so I get to the door of his apartment, and this young, kind of a waif young girl answered the door, and I thought she was, I don't know, his housekeeper or whatever. But it turns out it was Isabella Rossellini, who he had just married at that point. So she is raving about the bull, and Marty, let's put it over here, and so on. So finally we sat down, and I had an idea already, which I usually get right away after seeing a film. And I said, this title has to be, whatever we do, it's got to be in red. And I said, this guy's so passionate, and he bleeds all over the place. The red color has to be the dominant color. And he looked at me quizzically and said, "Dan, you just saw it. I shot it in black and white, and we're not going to transfer it to color film in order to release it. It's going to be black and white prints." He said, "How are you going to do that?" I said, "Just leave it to me. I know what to do." So once he approved it, and I also had said at that moment that this guy is not a raging bull. He's a raging bull. And for me, that meant to express that, to take the space out of the two words and make it one word jammed together. And I chose to do what's called big and little caps. So there was all cap letters, but the R and the B were bigger. So now this B is in the middle of this word that says Raging Bull, and it's in blood red. And so I had to execute that on film. So how I did it was copied the black and white master of the background of the boxer sparring with himself, and Marty shot it in slow motion. He shot it 48 frames instead of 24 frames. I then took double that again, so it was at 96 frames and even slower, more poetic and graceful and elegant. And then I chose. We would do a lot of other titles in the film that would identify the boxers and the matches, the dates that took place. So it was very much like a newspaper sort of feel to it. So I went through at that time, most newspapers used a Gothic type style on all their headlines and so on. So there was one News Gothic #2 that I chose to do all the titles with. Then I set them and tightened the space and created an element. And now that I copied it to black and white, to color stock, I then had the optical and lab problem of making that black and white, even though it was on color stock. So as a matter of what's called timing, we color correct, and the three layers of color stock, yellow, blue, and magenta, together make black. So I work with the timer who adjusted the color so that there was no yellow cast or blue cast, which often takes place when black and white images come to color stock. So once we had it timed so it would be dead black and white, look just like the black and white, the rest of the film, I then superimposed the title, all the titles over that sequence. And then the sequence ends at a face to black, and then it comes up with the story in black, from black and white stock that follows. So in order to get this piece of color stock onto a black and white film, it had to be spliced together. It was called positive editing. So I supervised the negative cutter, and we took the 75 prints that were made And over the shoulder of the negative cutter, I made sure they cut the color stock onto the black and white. And then after they cut a couple of them, we went to the projection room to view it. So now this black and white sequence on color stock looks gorgeous. And then it cuts to the first scene from the black and white, and suddenly it jumped out of frame. It was not yet, the heads were cut off or something had gone wrong. So I stopped and we went up to the projection booth and looked at the film. And only then did I realize, I didn't even notice it while they were cutting the film together, that color stock is thicker than black and white stock. So at the point that the splice was made, and when I went through the gate, it would bump the gate and throw it out of frame. So we had to do a special title on the head of the reel, even in front of the leader, that was addressed to the projectionist, that when he pulled the film down to load it onto the projector, you'd see this message that said, projectionist, ride the gate, which is the name for this little lever that you can see. And sometimes when you change over from one reel to another, it might be slightly out of frame. So the projectionist is ready when those dots that used to pop up just before the reel change, he would watch for, he knew that time that the title sequence was going to end, and he would be there to adjust in case the stock difference threw it out of frame.
Wow.
So the design had created a problem that I then had to solve in another way in order to make it work.
But boy, does it work. It's a great opening sequence, that. It really...
Yeah, it was worth it.
Yeah, it really was worth it, yeah. It's amazing to think that you create a problem just to that you need to overcome just to reach that artistic vision. And great that Marty was able to trust you in doing that and leave it in your capable hands.
Yeah, and of course I didn't know this was going to happen, so when there was no way to present the film without knowing to ride the gate on every projection, on every screening around the world. So we had to find a way to notify every projectionist that this problem could happen. And
That's crazy. That's great. Those days are gone. I bet the projectionists are happy about that, although there was a certain art to projection then. So coming from somebody like Scorsese, this seasoned director with a huge amount of experience, I'm sure you will have worked with many young directors. And I was thinking that these are often people that won't have grown up necessarily with physical newsprint, newspapers, magazines, even at all, maybe. I see kids of 1 or 2 on an iPad now, and they actually haven't got their hands on a book. As a kid, I always enjoyed like embossed books where you could actually feel the lettering and, actually kind of have a relationship with it. Does that change their relationship with the visual aspects of language, do you think, and what you do?
Well, I think it does. I always certainly give the director the respect that he deserves, just like, people were giving respect to Trump, even though he was incompetent. He was still the president at that point. So everyone was supposed to respect him. So similarly, I can be working with someone who's half my age, who's younger than my own son, but yet he's in the position of running this film. And it's my job to service him and give the film what it needs. So I approach it that way. And in my discussions, I will offer ideas just like I would a seasoned director. But I'm aware that I might not get the same kind of response because they don't have this life's worth of experience to draw from. And they might not be aware of all the things that I'm drawing from my experiences, know about filmmaking and technique and equipment and all those things that I'm used to using and working with. And they, whatever life experience they've had at that point, if they're 24 years old or whatever, is maybe different than my other life experiences as well. They come from the ghetto or from Spain or from wherever. They've lived a very different life. So all of those things I try to stay aware of so I can offer things that they will appreciate and see that it's good for the film. But it doesn't always go that way. recently, a couple of times I was asked to stop working on a film, even though I brought what I thought were really outstanding, effective ideas. Both times they were young filmmakers. One was from an Eastern European country and had done a few films there, and now he's doing his first American film. But we just didn't see eye to eye. He just initially he was over the moon with the idea that this famous guy was going to do his titles, but he then came to realize that he just didn't want what I was offering, and that was a disappointment. And it's happened twice now, so I'm wary, but yet, I'm asked to work on something, and as a professional, it's my job to do what I can.
Mm. But frustrating, I imagine, when you see the results of somebody else they might have gone with, and you could have done a better job, I guess.
Yeah, that's happened too, where I'll eventually go and see the film, and initially, when they feel that way, I'm disappointed and I'm rejected. I think, well, they must have, found some really great idea that is a lot better than what I was offering. So, more power to them. I hope it works out. And then I see what they did, and it's just so inferior. And I can't fathom their thinking. How did they wind up there where they could have been here? I don't know. It's perplexing and disappointing, but it's just part of the business, part of the job.
Your process to coming up with these ideas, you said, you watch the movie and you take in the emotional aspects of the movie. But is there anything you do when you're actually there with pencil and paper? Do you have music on? Do you... I often hear that, well, you mentioned it yourself, actually, that these ideas come fully formed sometimes.
Yes.
Does your creativity feel part of you, or does it feel external to you and you just need to kind of capture it?
That's an interesting question. I think both. Sometimes it's part of me and it's within me, and I'll see something, some complete unrelated, it'll just spark a thought and an image comes to mind. Other times I literally wake up having dreamt this idea.
Wow.
And I have to literally turn to my pad and paper right next to my bed and just sketch it out before it goes away. It evaporates sometimes and it's gone. It's not there anymore. And then I have to wait for it to come back. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes I'll have ideas right on the spot when I'm presenting ideas to the director, and then I'll just grab a piece of paper and sketch it. And hey, what about this? I'll say, or if what I'm showing, they're not following or they're not appreciating it, and then sometimes an idea might come to me right there on the spot. When I was doing the logo for the Samuel Goldwyn Company, Sam Jr. had just taken over the company. His famous father had died, and I learned then from him he wanted to bring a new look, a new modern look to his company. So I brought all these very elegant, elaborate, highly designed logos for Samuel Goldwyn Company, and he liked all of them, but felt they were all wrong for his company, so he rejected them. So now I'm walking out the door, and this idea came to my mind. So I literally turned and said, "Sam, what about this?" And I described this idea of a fountain pen coming into frame and scratching out, writing the signature of Samuel Goldwyn. So he liked it a lot. So I said, "Well, I'll come back with some more details." And so I did a storyboard on this one because it was just a matter of showing how the letters are adding on and being written, what angle you add, and how composition and so on. So I'm now describing this, and I'm showing Sam the storyboard. And I said, "So now your dad's signature comes on and it starts to say S." And he says, "Wait a minute. This isn't going to be my dad's signature. This is going to be my signature." So then I realized he really wanted it to be his company. And it could only be, if there's going to be a signature, it's got to be his, not his father's. So he later sent me a envelope full of paper where he just signed his name over and over and over. And he had circled the one he liked. So I then just copied that and animated it, hand animated it like the old time animators would have done. I still have the stack of cells here in my office from having done that. Yeah,
that's very cool. I don't mean this to sound like a sort of radio segue, but you talked about things coming in your dreams, and that immediately made me think about Nightmare on Elm Street, which
is about that. Yes,
yeah, it is about that, and it has, again, like we said, it sets the tone. But you get to establish the character, like the iconic part of the character in that sequence. He's building his glove there. How did that film come about, and what was the process behind creating that title sequence?
Well, the titles for those, I did 3 of the Nightmare films. The first one that Wes Craven directed was fairly straightforward. It was a logo that had to be, damaged, affected by this horrific person. And so it had this craggy, worn, beat up kind of feel to it. And it was blood red, of course. And I think it zoomed up and so on. But that established a viewpoint that later I was asked to do. The second one, part 2, that Jack Sholder directed, he had it under control and didn't need any help. But on part 3, that Chuck Russell directed, was his first film as a director. And I was on the short list of considering to direct the film. And when they finally chose Chuck, they gave me as a consolation the second unit to direct. So I wound up directing almost half the film. But part of that was shooting a title sequence. So I shot the main actor building this playhouse out of ice cream sticks, pieces of wood. And so it had to be full of horror. And the music I had available to me, which was this screaming long chords from a violin, and it was screeching and eerie and frightening. So that drove me to make all these odd shots from different angles that were punctuating and emphasizing the moment of her dropping up an ice cream stick with some glue and it dripping down, and looking and seeing her out of focus and all that. So I shot that sequence as part of my second unit, and then cut it into a length that could accommodate all the titles. And then they asked me to do a trailer for that film, which was going to be on 70 millimeter, that would be at the head of the next release, which was coming the following month. So I shot this one long shot of a little girl sitting on a bed with that playhouse in her lap, and the camera's dollying around her and examining all the details of the room and her legs and her dress and so on. And then as we get right next to her, the roof blows off the house and Freddy's glove comes out and is threatening you. So that was a growth from the first one, where the more I was involved, the more I could bring these horrific images to it that I was imagining, that I was seeing in my mind's eye and drawing from the film. And by the third one, I had created all the effect shots, all the shots, the violent shots and the fights and everything that I was directing. So it was organic and logical that it all progressed to the point where I was introducing the entire tone of the film through the footage that I'd shot and the designs that I'd done. Then part 4, I also did a sequence and directed the little girl that was part of the story and put titles over it. I never did anything with New Line after that. I don't know. I think I was pursuing getting a film to direct from them. And I think I sometimes offend people because I'm so insistent and deliberate that sometimes I push them away without realizing it. So that's how it went.
Yeah, I guess it goes that way sometimes. Nice to, as you say, have that progression through that series of films, though, to kind of develop your ideas and you create the next step. Have you worked on many sequels then? Because I was thinking actually about when you said about Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, of course. I remember seeing early storyboards where they attempted to do your crawl over the ice plains of the planet Hoth there at the start of the film.
Oh.
And then they abandoned it because, well, your idea was too good and too iconic to change, I guess. But
yeah, I know they used the same treatment on all of them, all the ones that were within the storyline of the original concept of 7 films, I guess it was. And they used exactly the same titles that I had done. But by the second one, they had computerized lathe bed camera stands that they could create the crawl and just put the camera at an angle that would duplicate the perspective angle. So they didn't need me to design them. They just duplicated what I had done. And there were different words perhaps on the subsequent films. But I've never seen any of them except for the first one, which I was at the cast crew screening and saw it that way. But even when I was working on it, I just thought it was this stupid space film, you know, it was dumb, and I wasn't happy working on it.
And it's funny, it's probably the one that people ask you about the most.
It is, yes.
I meant to ask you as well earlier that do you, obviously now in the computer realm, you'll go from a sketch, as you said, and scan it into the computer, but you would have worked with physical typeset and lettering, I imagine, at some point during your career. Do you enjoy that physical nature of it as well?
Yeah, I do. Now that I used to have a typesetter, you know, set all my type, and he had a computer or a version of a computer with fonts that were on strips of film, and, you know, each letter of the alphabet, one after the other, they roll it through and print the R and then the D and so on. But when computers were sophisticated enough where their software were the fonts that you could actually set from, I started setting my own, and I still do all my own typesetting. I love type, and you know, the beauty of every letter, the shape, and how they differ from one font to another. And it's all just still magical for me, and I get great pleasure out of literally setting type and spacing it and arranging it and all that. So I couldn't imagine letting someone else set my type, because I will always have to change it, because however I visualize it, now I can do exactly what I'm seeing and myself and put it together and save the money and the time. And it becomes better as well by the physical act of assembling it and arranging it and doing all the things that one can do once it's set.
I was just thinking as well how, as children, you know, we probably recognize logos, whether they're lettering or, you know, drawings of logos. We recognize those before we recognize words, and we're taught to recognize words by their shape and by their form. And that's what logos become, don't they? Like if I think of something like After Hours that you did, or Raising Arizona, that logo, we almost don't read it because it describes the film. It is the film. It becomes such an iconic part of that movie. Are there any of those that you look back on? You said you've not seen Star Wars since '77, but are there any that you do watch and are satisfied with your work that you've done?
Yes, certainly Taxi Driver, I've always considered to be my best work. And it's part of my reel. When I speak, I do a lot of Zooms now with different schools all over France and England and all of the US and Canada. And it's part of what I always show. And I never get tired of watching Taxi Driver. I mean, I love the music so much and the imagery, and it brings me back to when I was doing it and who I was working with and those days and weeks that I was involved with the film. So I still appreciate it, and I don't know if that's about ego or something else, but I don't get tired of it. I know it's good work, and I'm proud to have done it and been involved with it. I'm certainly glad that the things that I still like, others like as well, and they want to know about it and talk about it. So I always enjoy sharing not only the work, but how it came to be that. And out of that comes interesting information that schools and students and filmmakers and fans still want to know about. So it's ongoing for me. And, the more I can do of it, the better. I see it as simply the act of sharing what I know and what I've done. And I feel obligated to do that, not in any negative way. I don't like I have to do this. I don't want to, but I will. I really enjoy doing it, and I think it's necessary that I give back and I share what I've done for others and with others who might benefit by it and can go on with their own career and do things that they might have been inspired by my work or encouraged to pursue it. So I talk to a lot of students in that way and try to give them that information. Recently, I was talking to the Gobelins animation school, the famous school in Paris, and there was a couple of hundred students on the Zoom, and there was one young girl who had some really interesting, very creative and intelligent questions for me, and I realized that she had something, and that she needed help to pursue her work. So I later talked to the instructor who ran that Zoom and told her that I wanted to help that person. So now I'm mentoring her. And I have phone calls with her every week from her apartment in Paris. And she shows me her work and I talk about my work and just helping her move along in her career as Saul Bass did with me.
Mentoring is such an important part, isn't it, of the creative industries, and we've all got our mentors,
really
and there is an imperative, I think, in a lot of us to kind of pass that knowledge on. And I think that's great. What a lucky young lady.
Imperative is the right word. Yeah. And I sent her a book, and she just got it recently, and she's raving about it, and that's always fun to get reaction from what I put in the book and so on. You mentioned earlier the tactile feel of an embossed cover. That's my cover. Is very. You've seen it, I'm sure, on the website, right?
I've seen it on the website. So tell me about your book, Dan. What kind of drove you to put that together, and also where can people get it? Because my listeners I've got graphic designers listening. I've got all sorts of people listening. So. Yeah.
Well, though it's available for sale at a few bookstores here in LA, it's the only place it's available is on my website, danperri.com, and one can buy it, and then the order comes to me personally, and because I'm offering an autograph and film strips as two options. So for a person which shows the options of the film strips and my autograph, then I've got to personally sign it, and I make it out to them with some message, and then I cut up 35mm prints of the frames that are the logos of the films that are in the book, and I include those in a little envelope, and then I pack it up and take it to the post office and mail it out to them. And it's now I can't even mention all the countries that it's gone to: Switzerland, Belgium, Italy, France, Germany, Ireland, England, and all of the US. And I think I've sold about 150 or 60 now, that every one of them I've handled and mailed out to them. So it's certainly gratifying. And then I get a lot of emails back and compliments, and it's been good. I have a social media presence now, and my friends in Toronto who are kind of building the site on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter continue to put things up that I've done, or incidents or moments or stories and things like anecdotes, and so people are enjoying it, and I'm glad that I'm reaching them. They're finding it.
Good. Well, I'll do my part as well, Dan, in telling my listeners and followers to get it. I'm certainly buying it, and I also have a good friend of mine who's a graphic designer who has a birthday coming up soon. So I think I'll be ordering
you benefit by it.
Yeah.
And I wrote it kind of with students in mind when I describe things. And working optically is very complicated, and there's all kinds of equipment and unique words for the processes and things. So, but I tried to simplify it so that they could understand what I was doing and how I use the equipment. So it's more in layman's language, so that it can reach more people who want to know about it. Yeah.
It feels like that is a nice natural end there, Dan. I did have another question that I might, if it's okay if I ask you this.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure, please.
I was watching King of Comedy back again recently,
Mm-hmm.
and in the same way that the titles in After Hours kind of fly into frame, and you see them quickly, and you're kind of
right.
You're in the moment of that film straight away. That film terrified me as well as a kid. I remember
Yeah.
being stuck there in New York. But King of Comedy has that wonderful freeze frame looking through the car of Sandra Bernhardt, and it holds that for the entire sort of bulk of that sequence, and then we're back into the action again. What was the inspiration behind that?
Well, Marty had wanted to, I chose that frame, but he wanted to do something to stop the action. And obviously, well, then we want a freeze frame, right, Marty? That it was that kind of moment. And so I chose a frame where you would really feel the tension of all this anger and fury that was going on, that comes to a halt, that you can really analyze it. So holding it for the length of the title sequence was the right thing to do. And then if the title floated down and kind of settled in front of this, that allow you to still see that moment, that stopping time, but then go through the titles in a unique way. So I chose to reverse the emphasis of the first and last name, where normally the first name is less important than the last name, and I always make it smaller. I just did the reverse of that. And so I chose a very thin type style and a very thick, bold type style, and jam them together. And then they just gracefully move from one to the next. So that was the origins of that. And then when it cuts back to the horrors of the moment, it's suddenly created a quietness that is now gone. So the contrast is severe. Wow, you're hit with all this chaotic goings on from this moment of calm, quiet, and the music is gentle, and it's just delivering this information in a very calm way that is unlike the rest of the film.
It earns that moment, doesn't it? I was talking to a sound designer, Mark Mangini, who talked about use of silence and stillness. He says never absolute silence, but just how you earn that moment to bring in the sound again and make it all that more impactful. So it's
very wise to know that the contrast exists, that can be used so effectively.
That kind of reminds me, as a final comment, I guess, Dan, that kind of reminds me that to do what you do, you have to be so aware of all the tools in your palette as a filmmaker and as an artist. You have to understand music and sound and editing and framing and directing and so many things. They feel like, in a way, they're small productions on their own, aren't they? Title sequences.
They are, yeah. And I'm proud of my both ability and my appreciation for knowing all those things. It's certainly necessary for me, but I'm proud that I took the time and was fortunate to have the opportunities to learn all those things. And they're all the tools in my toolbox. And when they were optical tools, I had to know what they could do, what their limitations were, and how best to get the effects that I wanted from them, having known what they can do. So then when digital came along, I saw that the same thing existed, but in executing it in a different, easier way. So I already had the knowledge of what those things could do, those tools, but just had to learn how to physically use them, how to run the computer and have them do. Although I don't do the complicated effects, I have a digital artist who I sit with and direct to do. But I have to know what that equipment can do, what that software can do. And where in the optical world, you could imagine something and then you find that it can't be done. The equipment couldn't do it. So I have to then adjust to the idea to be able to execute it. Whereas now anything you can imagine digitally can be done. It then becomes a matter of, is there enough time to do it? and there's enough money to do it. But it's possible to do most anything. And ironically, now I'm coming to projects where they want me to do things like I did on film, or even do it on film if I can. So I'm back to doing things that are comparatively simpler than what you can do digitally. But because of the filmmaker or maybe the story that he's telling, I'm compelled to do something simpler, more like I used to do years ago. So it's kind of full circle.
Yeah, satisfying.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks for giving your time, and from all of us on this side of film, we appreciate your work, and thank you for making so many iconic moments in film.
It's been a pleasure talking with you, Jamie. Thanks so much for the opportunity. And if I can help you further, if you need more, just let me know.
Lovely. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
I hope you enjoyed my chat there with Dan Perri. He's a really humble guy and clearly understands, his art and craft and how it contributes to the overall picture. Thank you, Dan, for giving your time. And as I said in the conversation there, do check out Dan's book at danperri.com. There's a little tab at the top saying book. I've ordered mine and I've gone for the big one with the signature and the film cells and everything else. So do check it out because I think you'll be interested. And if you're anything like me, do check it out, because if you're anything like me, I'm pretty sure you'll be interested. And I think you are like me, in a way. And I also think it's, always good to support independent publishers. Some news about what's coming up on the podcast. Earlier this week, I spoke to, rather excitingly, a real film legend and hero of mine for many years, Walter Murch. If you remember back to episode 27, I spoke with John Lefkowitz, who directed a documentary about Walter. Well, shortly after that, I managed to get in touch with Walter. I approached it from two angles. I got in touch with a filmmaker that he'd worked with recently, and also somebody that I previously interviewed on this podcast. And that double attack worked wonders, because both emails arrived at pretty much the same time, and I got a nice email from Walter saying, "Oh, hi, so-and-so and so-and-so tell me that you would like to talk to me. What would you like to talk about?" And we've been having a conversation over email for a couple of weeks, which I have to say it's one of the highlights of this podcast endeavour so far. I was then fortunate enough to go and see Walter give a lecture in Primrose Hill in North London. It was kind of my first trip out into sort of a public space since March 2020. It was a bit weird, but it was a fantastic evening listening to Walter's wonderful stories about his work and his time in the film industry as both sound editor and editor. But as John Lefkowitz and I were saying, he's more than that. He's a philosopher, he's a scientist, he's a translator, and quite frankly, I could listen to him talk for hours. In fact, I did. Good old YouTube and DVD and Blu-ray commentaries meant that I was listening pretty much to wall-to-wall Walter Murch for about a week there. That's all I had to get my research together. I think it was 8 days. So just this Monday, the 28th of June, I was able to speak to Walter. We spoke for just over an hour. Despite having a few more episodes already in the bag, I think I'm going to bring this one forward because, well, I'm quite excited about it, and I think you're going to enjoy it very much. Talking of high-profile guests, I have another two that I've spoken to already. Oscar-winning sound designer Gary Ridestrom. There really is a through line from Walter Murch to Ben Burt to Gary Ridestrom, so I hope you enjoy that one. Secondly, I spoke to John Patrick Shanley, he of many plays and films, including Joe vs. the Volcano, Moonstruck, for which he won an Oscar, and Doubt, the wonderful film starring Meryl Streep, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Amy Adams and Viola Davis. Again, we spoke for just over an hour, and he's a very interesting guy. I mean, the answers he gave to my average questions were fantastic, and it made me think about things in a way that I'd not really thought about before. That's what's so great about doing this podcast, is getting the opportunity to speak to these people and share their stories, but also it's an education for me. And it's one of the aspects that I really do love about meeting these people and hearing all these different perspectives, not just on the film industry, but in life in general. I've come away from a few of them now, just kind of looking at the world a bit differently. So join me again for the Walter Murch episode later in July 2021. And in the meantime, be good, stay safe, look after yourselves, and I'll see you back here soon. Are you still here, Caroline? This is the end of the podcast. You can switch it off now.